All right. So, moving forward, we are last week we studied Isaiah chapters 6 and 7, the whole of chapter 6 and the beginning of chapter 7. And now, our main study this morning, we're going to skip over to Isaiah chapter 9 and like the very, very first two verses of chapter 10. If you want to know what you missed in chapter 8, I'd encourage you to read in between, during your own personal time. I'd encourage you to read, if we're going to skip chapters, I'd encourage you to read the chapters in between. But mostly, chapter 8 is continuing with Isaiah talking about there will be a great force that comes against the people of Judah. Along the same veins, more metaphors, more visual language of what exactly this force coming against Israel is going to be. But mostly the message is the same. There is going to be a great force coming against Israel because you have turned away from God. There at the very end is where it'll start to kind of bleed into the beginning of our lesson this morning, is whenever it talks about darkness turning to light. And it's warning when those tell you to consult mediums and spiritists, people who would claim to be able to talk to the dead, to be able to cross the spiritual barrier and speak to those beyond this world. It just warns that again, that there's not much stock to be put in there, that is not people who are designated by the Lord to do that. And the very end there, it says that those who look towards the earth will see only distress and darkness and fearful gloom, and they will be thrust into utter darkness. And then we start chapter 9 with a but. And so, and even in some translations, in the original Hebrew text, actually chapter 9 verse 1 is actually listed as chapter 8 verse 23. So there's a kind of give or take on whether or not verse 1 is actually verse 1 of chapter 9 or the last verse of chapter 8, which isn't that important, but just like the theme kind of continues, so it's good to kind of recognize that. So that first verse there, nevertheless, there will be no more gloom for those who were in distress. So, as we start our study here of chapter 9, let's read verses 1 again. Verses 1 through... Just verses... Oh, okay, I had my marker in a different place. Sorry. Verses 1 through 7. So let's read verses 1 through 7.
Nevertheless, the gloom will not be upon her who is distressed, as when at first he lightly esteemed the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, and afterward more heavily oppressed her, by the way of the sea beyond the Jordan, in Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in the land of the shadow of death, upon them a light was shined. Have you multiplied the nation and increased its joy? They rejoice before you, according to the joy of heart, as men rejoice when they divide the spoil. For you have broken the yoke of his burden, and the staff of his shoulder, the rod of his oppressors, as in the day of Midian. For every warrior's sandal from the noisy battle, and garments rolled in blood, will be used for burning and fuel of fire. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulder, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace.
And one more, verse 7.
1:7, okay. Of the increase of his government and peace, there will be no end, upon the throne of David and over his kingdom, to order it and establish it with judgment and justice. From that time forward, even forever, the zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this.
All right, thank you. So, lots of good meaty stuff in this little section right here. First off, we want to focus on it talks about, Isaiah says, "In the past he humbled the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but in the future he will honor Galilee of the nations by the way of the sea beyond the Jordan." Geographically, where is the lands of Zebulun and Naphtali located? Originally, they were given lands that are in the northern kingdom, in Israel. So that tribe, that land plots would be a part of the Israelites that is now conquered. That as he's speaking to the people in Judah, they are hearing about the lands of Naphtali and Zebulun being humbled, and they would go, well, yeah, the northern kingdom of Israel, that entire thing has been humbled by the Assyrians and the other kingdom, which I'm blinking on right now. But it says that in the future, he will honor Galilee of the nations by way of the sea beyond the Jordan. And here's where we start to benefit from having the ability to look back on Jesus' life versus what Isaiah says, because where is the first area that Jesus, when he starts traveling, where is the first area that he kind of settles? Galilee. The first area that he settles is not around Jerusalem, around where mainly there would be Jews and Israelites settled. Where does he settle? In the land of the Gentiles, mainly. And the main reason for this is the reason that Zebulun and Naphtali were humbled initially is because the Israelites, when they first established in Canaan, were commanded to drive out the Canaanites and any other people that might be there so that it would just be the Israelites. But Naphtali, the clan of Zebulun and Naphtali, did not do this. They let some of the Canaanites stay there, and as the Bible says, eventually they are led away from God by just there being lots of different practices and such things. And now we see a very similar thing happening right now with the northern kingdom of Israel and with the southern kingdom of Judah. And so Zebulun and Naphtali have now twice, because of their inability to keep themselves pure, to make sure that they are following only God's commands, they're finding their land once again conquered and taken away because they're led away from God's word. But we know that the first place that Jesus, the literal Son of God, goes to preach and to teach and to perform miracles is those same lands. Yeah, the area beyond the Jordan River by way of the sea in Galilee. And so when Isaiah prophesies the people walking in darkness, a light has dawned, you have enlarged the nation, increased their joy, and they rejoice before you as people rejoice at the harvest. He's talking about the coming of Jesus. And this is where, once we get down to verse 6, for to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace. This is where we first see them directly talking about what exactly the coming of the Son that we previously talked about in chapter 6 is going to do for that land. We know, we talked about in chapter 6 that the Son who will be called Emmanuel is coming to the Israelites, but now we know exactly, he started to talk about what's going to happen. And yeah, not only is Jesus going to teach, not only is Jesus going to bring the word of the Lord to the people who the Jews might not view as God's people, he's also going to come to heal, to perform miracles, to do things that, unless they're through God, are just simply impossible. And to be a light, as we always like to talk about being a light to others. Jesus was the initial light in the darkness of oppression, the darkness of not even knowing about God and his word. And the book really focuses on the way that Jesus is coming. He's described as many things: Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, but that last one is what the book really focuses on, Prince of Peace. When the Israelites first heard the prophecies of a coming Messiah, they thought that it was going to be a conquering hero, that it was going to be someone who would help the Israelites rise up throw off the oppression of the literal physical governments that were oppressing them and lead them into establishing a physical earthly kingdom where they would not be oppressed anymore. However, in all these descriptions in this first section of the chapter, what kind of things are being cast aside? What kind of things are going to be burned up? What kind of footwear specifically does it talk about being tossed aside?
Sandals.
Sandals of
Warriors.
a warrior. Yeah, a warrior's boot, used in battle, and every garment rolled in blood will be destined for burning, will be a fuel for the fire. He's not, yeah, Jesus is not a conquering hero. He's not coming to drive out the Assyrians. He wasn't coming to drive out the Romans in the time of the New Testament. He's coming as a prince of peace. Someone who there will be no longer be need for war, for violence, for oppressing of others. But the conquering that he brings is, as we like to talk about, we conquer people's hearts. That the message of the Lord is the good news. That he comes to let people know that there is no more reason to cry, that there's no reason to be suspicious of your neighbors, that now is the time for showing love to one another. And so it finishes up with the zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. Which makes me think of when Jesus goes to the synagogue and sees the tax collectors and the people selling birds for sacrifice and stuff. What is it quoted whenever Jesus starts flipping the tables and driving them out? What is the verse that is quoted? Zeal for my Father's house will consume me. That the closest thing that Jesus ever comes to violence is not really an act of violence or an act of anger. It is an act of driving out the sin and the uncleanness that is in the house of God. And that is just a very concentrated version of what Jesus came to do, is to lead his people and to clear out all the sin and the congestion, one might say, of the Lord's church. Which, as we see, moves from being a physical building where people come to meet and more of the people of God. It's one of our favorite things to say is, yeah, the church is not the building, the church is the people. And so now we are seeing Isaiah preaching about things that are very much would be very progressive, very futuristic things of talking about, yeah, someone who comes to conquer but not on earth has come to preach a good word of peace to those. And so we get this nice like shining moment of like hope and happiness coming that Isaiah is talking to the Israelites about yeah, the coming wonderful counselor, mighty God, everlasting Father, Prince of Peace, of greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne. As we know, Jesus is of the line of David, so his throne is literally the inheritance of being of King David's line. And over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on forever. But then Isaiah has to remind the Israelites of what's going on right now. We've had this nice, wonderful, hopeful message, and now the Lord's anger against Israel. And before we move into Isaiah's next warning about the Lord's anger, do we have any other thoughts on the coming of Jesus, of the Prince of Peace? All right. So, we've had our nice message, and now we have to be reminded, the Assyrians are still right on your doorstep, guys. If we want to read verses 8, and let's read through verses 17.
The Lord sends a message against Jacob, and it falls on Israel, and all the people know it, that is Ephraim and the inhabitants of Samaria, asserting in pride and in arrogance of heart. The bricks have fallen down, but we will rebuild with smooth stones. The sycamores have been cut down, but we will replace them with cedars. Therefore the Lord raises against them adversaries from Rezin and spurs their enemies on. The Arameans on the east and the Philistines on the west, and they devour Israel with gaping jaws. In spite of all of this, his anger does not turn away, and his hand is still stretched out.
Thank you. Let's stop right there real quick.
Okay.
So, the Lord is still angry, and his words fall against Jacob, and it will fall on Israel, and all people will know it. That Isaiah is assuring them that this is not going to be this small thing that will just quickly blow over. It says that even the people who are outside of this whole conflict, the people around and the people involved and uninvolved in this conflict, are going to know the Lord's anger. It says, all people know Ephraim, the inhabitants of Samaria, who say with pride and arrogance of heart, the bricks have fallen down, but we will rebuild with dressed stone. The fig trees have been felled, but we will replace them with cedars. What's wrong with the idea of rebuilding here? Right now, the Israelites are looking at this thing that the Lord has torn down, and they think, well, we can make this better. We'll take, those bricks have fallen down. We'll take stones that we have smoothed out to be even more solid, to fit better together. We'll rebuild it. We have the fig trees that have been felled. We will replace them with cedars. They're not thinking about letting that which God has set up come back. They're only thinking about moving on to the next best thing in their own minds. They want to rebuild the temples with stones that are from different areas. They want to plant trees that were normally indigenous to the area. They want to plant new kinds of trees. They don't want to let the fig trees grow back. They want to plant new, better trees that will, in the future, totally make them even forget about the things that they had before.
I think they're failing to realize that God is thinking of the heart, not of physical material.
Yeah. All they can see is, their buildings are down, and they can see that trees are gone. They can't see that, why are the trees gone? Why are the buildings being knocked down?
And they think the bigger, the better, the more lavish, the more it'll please God. That isn't what he's after.
Yeah. Initially, when David talked about building the Lord a temple, he said, did I ask for a house of cedar? Did I ask for you to build me great things? No. I asked you to worship me.
Keep my commandments.
Yeah, keep my commandments. In the same way, we've already studied talking about these mansions and great buildings that you built for yourself and for me. There's going to be ruins in the future because I'm fixing to tear it all down. I'm fixing to wipe the slate clean, and strangers will eat in the ruins of what were once great mansions. So all they're focusing on right now is the physical buildings.
But yet in that last verse there that you read, his hand was still stretched out to them. He would still have them turn back to him, but they wouldn't. They were depending on their own power, their own pride to rebuild rather than looking to God.
Yet for all this, his anger is not turned away. His hand is still upraised. That even though that there have been warnings, there have been all these signs and different things that feels like we've done this over and over, that God's getting this feeling of deja vu. Have I done this before? Yes, absolutely. That his anger is not turned away, his hand is still upraised. And this is such a concrete ideal in this verse that we're going to see those exact words again. Because Isaiah is going to reiterate in this next section, the Lord is still upset. So if we want to read verses 13 through 17.
The people turneth not unto him that smiteth them, neither do they seek the Lord of hosts. Therefore the Lord will cut off from Israel head and tail, branch and rush in one day. The ancient and honorable, he is the head. And the prophet that teacheth lies, he is the tail. For the leaders of this people cause them to err, and that they that are led of them are destroyed. Therefore the Lord shall have no joy in their young men, neither shall have mercy on the fatherless and widows. For every one is a hypocrite and an evildoer, and every mouth speaketh folly. For all this his anger is not turned away, but his hand is stretched out still.
So, the people have not returned to him who struck them. The people of Israel have turned away from God repeatedly and have seen his punishment more than a few times. And yet they still do not return to him who struck them, nor have they sought the Lord Almighty. In the book of Judges, we see many times that the Israelites have gone through being conquered or being threatened by other tribes. And once the judge comes around and turns their head in the right direction, then they move back towards the Lord, and there is a time of peace. There is a time of prosperity. And then we do it all again. But the issue here is that the Lord has sent a great army, has conquered an entire northern kingdom, and has taken over every city except for this one where we are preaching right now. And yet, what are the Israelites focused on? Like we talked about, their buildings, their trees. They are hearing the words of the Lord straight from a prophet, and they still refuse to go back to God. And so, the Lord will cut off Israel, from Israel, both head and tail. What's the importance of the head and the tail? We tend to realize the head is a pretty important part of the body. It kind of houses everything that makes everything else go. And what is the importance of a tail? Not in a human context, obviously, we don't have tails. But what is the importance of a tail to an animal?
Stabilizes us.
Stability. Helps them with balance. In some animals, it's become so developed that it's almost like another limb. See, in spider monkeys, they can hang from their tails. Opossums can do that, surprisingly, which is just another side. Animals are cool. Creation's really cool. But, so, the importance of the head and the tail is the center of the body that gives commands to others and moves them in a direction, causes them to do tasks, and the tail that keeps it stable, that keeps it from veering one way or another. Both of the two areas that keep the body on track, and yet now the body has become so lost, has become so unbalanced, that God is saying, okay, I've got to trim the ends and start this over again. What's the problem with the head of the Israelites? The elders and the dignitaries, the prophets who teach lies, the elders and the dignitaries are the head. And it says, those who guide this people mislead them, and those who are guided are led astray. The leaders are not leading Israel in the right direction. It is their responsibility to keep everything going the direction it should be. It is their job to make sure that the commandments of God are carried out, and that nothing else is let in to corrupt that. And in the same importance, the prophets who teach lies are the tail. They should be the filter through which all of the leader's commands goes. Yeah.
This is just a side note, but you wonder where the name tail come from. But anyway, it's used on our aircraft. The rear end of the aircraft is called the tail. And that's because there's two important facets of that, the rudder and the horizontal stabilizer. And they both have flaps. And as you're a pilot flying down, you adjust the rudder a little bit this way, a little bit left, to keep on the straight path. And even in a ship, the tail end of the ship contains the rudder. And the rudder does the same thing. It guides that ship and keeps it stable.
What happens if either of those things get stuck?
You bail out.
Because what's happening to what you're in? It's heading off in a direction that you don't want.
Yeah, you gotta try to correct it.
Yeah.
Either
Yeah.
that or that's when the flight engineer steps in. He knows everything.
Yeah. But yes. Our meaning is that yes, you can't just have a head, you can't just have a tail. Is that in almost every construction we have, whether it be a building, whether it be a machine, whether it is our physical bodies, the head and the tail are you can't have one without the other, and one cannot be jammed because then it'll lead the other astray, yeah.
It's also like the church body too. You know, I remember when we did appointed elders here and deacons, and you know, a church could do a slow turn, and it's, you know, we gotta make sure that it's pure into the word, the written word. Because everybody knows and sees what's out there right now. It's a, you know, a phone book full of churches to whatever need, but it's gotta stay true and pure.
Just like, yeah, the elders and the dignitaries and the prophets of the city, we now have elders and the ministers who help lead us along what the word commands. And so then the body of the church, the people who are not in those leadership positions, are also responsible for making sure that what is coming from the elders is biblical. Is you have that checks and balances almost that most governments are set upon, is that one group does not have all the power. You cannot have all the weight to one side or else you start to tip. That the leaders read the word, that they synthesize exactly what the meaning of the scripture is, and then lead the church in that direction based on that, on those decisions. And then the body of the Christ follows that, but also keeps in mind that if something seems to be going astray, that they ask the question so that they themselves can learn if that's not something they understand, or if something is slightly off kilter, that the whole thing gets righted. They start heading in the right direction again. Yeah, the whole idea of the head and tail of the city is almost directly transferable to the head and the tail of the church today. But in the context of the Israelites, the head and the tail have been so cattywampus, have been so off kilter, that now it's time to hard reset. We gotta go to the shop, we gotta realign everything, we gotta make sure that either if the old parts cannot be realigned, time to get new parts. Time to replace. And so, the Lord will cut off from Israel both head and tail, both palm branch and reed in a single day. Those who guide this people mislead them, and those who are guided are led astray. Therefore, the Lord will take no pleasure in the young men, nor will he pity the fatherless and the widows, for everything is ungodly and wicked, and every mouth speaks folly. The leaders have led the city in such a direction that now not even those who are taught to be in need of help and are in need of compassion, even they are ungodly and wicked. Every mouth speaks folly. The Israelites have so completely gone into a tailspin that there is no saving. That it needs just a total reset. And even with all this preaching, again, that there will be changes made, that there will be punishments doled out, what's there at the end of verse 17? Yet for all this, his anger is not turned away, his hand is still upraised. We've talked about the arrogance of the Israelites, how they focus on their buildings, how they focus on their earthly means instead of turning to God, and so the Lord is still angered against them. Now we see that the Lord is going to just reset the clock on the Israelites. He's going to turn everything back to factory reset. And even still, the Lord's anger is not turned away. His hand is still upraised. And so, we look at here in verses 18 through 21, the end of the chapter here. If someone wants to read that real quick. 18 through 21.
For wickedness burns like a fire. It consumes briars and thorns. It even sets the thickets of the forest aflame, and they roll upward in a column of smoke. By the fury of the Lord of hosts, the land is burned up, and the people are like fuel for the fire. No man spares his brother. They slice off what is on the right hand, but still are hungry. And they eat what is on the left hand, but they are not satisfied. Each of them eats the flesh of his own arm. Manasseh devours Ephraim, and Ephraim Manasseh, and together they are against Judah. In spite of all this, his anger does not turn away, and his hand is still stretched out.
All right. So in our final show of the punishment that is coming, it says, surely wickedness burns like a fire. It consumes briars and thorns. It sets the forest thickets ablaze so that it rolls upwards in a column of smoke. It shows that the wickedness is not just burning briars and thorns, which we often kind of have a parallel with, tangled up with sin, with evilness. That it not only burns up the briars and thorns, the bad things, but it also sets ablaze forest thickets so that it rolls upwards in a column of smoke. The fire of wickedness is not peaking. That when sin and corruption truly spread like wildfire, it isn't just going to burn up those which are evil and wicked. It's going to take everything with it. That even if there is a small bit of good in the city of Jerusalem right now, that the fire of wickedness is not going to spare them, that it's not going to go around those who might be considered good in the city of Jerusalem, that this fire of wickedness is going to spread and destroy everything. And then it makes an interesting comparison. It says, by the wrath of the Lord Almighty, the land will be scorched, and the people will be fuel for the fire. So here we see wickedness and the Lord's wrath both described as a fire. I thought this was interesting because when we think about sickness in a body, what is often one of the most telling symptoms in the human body that there is sickness or infection?
Fever.
Fever, yes, which is just simply a higher body temperature. And here we're going to get into, we're going to give you med and background people your time to shine. What is a fever? What is your body attempting to do by raising its own temperature, by giving you a fever? Burning out the virus. It's trying to burn out that which is bad. We oftentimes, when we're little, we think that a fever is part of the sickness. We think that the sickness is causing the fever. But in actuality, in the most simplest layman terms, I know that there's a lot more complexity to this, but yeah, the fever is trying to create conditions in which the bacteria cannot survive. And so here I think it's interesting that we talk about the fire of wickedness, but then we also read about the fire of the wrath of the Lord Almighty. That the Lord's wrath in this case is the destruction that comes from the wickedness. That the land will be scorched and the people will be fuel for the fire, and they will not spare one another. That the Lord is using the people's own wickedness against them. As it talks about, on the right they will devour but still be left hungry, and on the left they will eat but not be satisfied. That these people will search more and more for some kind of cure, for something to satisfy their wants, and yet never does it say that they will ever be satisfied. That eventually, what does it say? That each will feed on the flesh of their own, as John's reading says, arm, some say of their own offspring. That Manasseh will feed on Ephraim, that Ephraim will feed on Manasseh, Ephraim and Manasseh being some of Joseph's two sons that are blessed by Israel in his old age, that brother will eat brother and the other brother will also eat the other brother. That nothing will have any kind of holiness. There will be no, they'll just go to disgusting lengths to be satisfied. They'll eat their own flesh. They'll eat their own family, their own children. Brother will eat brother. And eventually, yeah, all this destruction and corruption, as he says, will turn towards Judah. Yet for all this, his anger is not turned away, and his hand is still upraised. Israel's messed up, y'all. That the Lord is one who protects his people, but when it comes right down to it, he will do exactly what is necessary to make sure that what is left of his people know, I am the way. There is no other path but me. And we're blessed to live in a time where that news is coming from the mouth of Jesus and the mouth of the apostles, that the Lord's wrath came against sin, that Jesus became the sacrifice for all of our sins, and that we don't live in a time where we have armies marching and trying to obliterate every single aspect of the way that we live because we've turned away from the Lord's word. Because yeah, here we see how complete, how unbiased the justice of the Lord is. Any other thoughts before we head to our last couple verses? Yeah.
You know, we don't have armed invaders doing this to us, but just like the people that we're studying about here, we're doing it to ourselves in so many ways. And I can't help but think, when I think about the fire that consumes the briars and thorns also consumes the forest. You know, we have people in our culture today, in our country today, that are spreading falsehood and propaganda in our schools. And the fire that consumes those that are in error there are also going to consume innocent children who can't make their own decisions, or you know, the parents are not allowed to help straighten them out. We are shoving a doctrine down their throats that is going to result in widespread destruction, just like the people we're studying about here.
Each will feed on the flesh of their own offspring. That translation becomes so much more poignant, yeah. Is that there is, yeah, exactly what you said. There is misinformation spread. There is things that are not accurate in S.I.N.
But the work of Satan is to turn people against each other, and that's what happened there. And it's warned about in the Galatian letter that in the church we fight and devour one another. That's a work of Satan. It's divisive.
Mm-hmm.
And when sin enters in, like it had with Israel, that's one of the results.
Yep. Yeah. I think that plays into our last couple verses here. If we want to read those real quick, I'll just finish that up. Woe, there's one more woe. Not in the entire book of Isaiah, but Isaiah has one more woe to kind of go along with this whole deal. Woe to those who make unjust laws, those who issue oppressive decrees, to deprive the poor of their rights, to withhold justice from the oppressed of my people, making widows their prey and robbing the fatherless. After talking about all these things about the Lord cutting off the head, of getting rid of the leaders who have led his people astray, he gives one more woe. Woe to those who make unjust laws, who issue oppressive decrees, and to deprive the poor of their rights and withhold justice from the oppressed of my people. When it seems that leadership cares less about being just, cares less about fighting for the rights of those who are less privileged, to those who do not get the same rights as the rest of the people in their country, that's when it becomes very, very, very concerning. When the leadership, and I don't want to get too political this morning because we're fixing to hit our timer, but when leadership cares more about keeping you on their side, about keeping the people who follow the same beliefs that they do behind them, instead of trying to find common ground to better the lives of the people that they lead, that's whenever leadership becomes unfit to continue doing what they do. I think, in my own personal opinion, I feel like there is so much misinformation specifically to turn us against each other. That there's so much, you have to be on one side or the other. There is no room in the middle. That despite the fact that we are all children of God, that we are all made in His image, that we are all inheritors of the kingdom of God, that we have to be in one half of the kingdom or the other half. That there is folks who will tell you that if you believe one specific thing, then you believe a whole bunch of other things that might not necessarily fall into what you believe. That we have to remember that just because we don't share a single specific belief with someone doesn't mean that we cannot agree with that person on anything. And thus we have to realize that, yeah, people who spread that misinformation, that teach falsehoods, that lead a group of people, whether it be schools, whether it be government, whether it be bridge club, that people who say that you can only believe one thing or the other, that's a false narrative. That isn't something that is remotely true. You can believe one thing that would be considered conservative, and then believe something else that might be considered liberal. That beliefs do not have to fall under one umbrella. And so we have to call, yeah, sorry, go
Or
ahead.
things that do not involve the way.
Hmm.
Matters of, things that are specifically talked about in the Bible, no, but other things, how we spend our money, things like that, yes. But there are things that are not a matter of opinion,
Hmm.
which I know is what you're saying.
No, but no, that's very important. And our last, I think we have to wrap it up here, but our last point that I want to make here is that as leaders, as people who go out and have sway over how we follow our lives, how we encourage others to live their lives, is we have to remember what God commands most of all is, in that last verse it says, "Woe to who makes unjust laws and who make oppressive decrees, who deprive the poor of their rights and withhold justice from the oppressed of my people." Being a Christian leader means fighting for those who have less. It doesn't mean establishing your own Christian beliefs as the only way to lead. Being a Christian leader means raising the poor up, means fighting to help those who are oppressed daily. Even if we do not see those oppressions in our own lives, part of leading by Christian example is helping those who struggle more than we do. Thank you for a great class.